Hello and welcome back to the Cine Skinny podcast. It's Peter today in the office to introduce something that we recorded over the weekend. As we mentioned before, me, Ellie, Jamie and Anna Heat were invited by the Glasgow Film Theatre to introduce a screening of Matthias and Maxime, Xavier Dolan's 2020 film as part of their Queer Cinema Sundays programme. We went through, we did it was good fun, and then we did a kind of panel discussion afterwards. Now, owing to various technical reasons that I'll not get into, the recording is not of the pristine quality that you can hear right now, but hopefully it works as an artifact of an interesting discussion about the works of Xavier Dolan and the work of other excellent queer filmmakers from the 21st century. So, fair warning, the sound quality is variable, but I've done my very best. If you've got any issues, do not refrain from emailing me on cinyskinny@theskinny.co.uk. You may or may not get a response. Thanks to the GFT for having us. Thanks to Rosie from Queer Cinema Sundays for inviting us to come along. It was a lovely time, as I'm sure you can tell by the following conversation, which begins with Anna Heat talking a little bit about Matthias and Maxime. So enjoy that, and we'll be back with a regular episode next week, I think. Yes, next week. Right, bye-bye.
I was really struck watching it. I've seen this film like maybe 10 times or something. I've seen it so many times. And I was really struck watching it this time how much it's a queer film, but it's also very much a film about heterosexuality, almost more than it is queerness, and about how heterosexuality is constructed kind of both socially and within kind of more intimate dynamics. It's really interesting. One of the first shots is that like advertisement, which is the like sans famille, like bread thing, and just thinking a lot about, like how heterosexuality permeates all of these like constructs that we have, like the nuclear family, parenthood, like your friendships, masculinity, and how it becomes this kind of prison. Like these men are all really, they're like close to each other and they love each other, but there's like such an underlying theme of like repression going throughout, and there's like homophobic insults that they exchange. I just think it's so, it says a lot. And I think that's why it's such an interesting queer film, because it kind of goes past a lot of the markers of what we think of as queer cinema and a lot of like those narratives. And it's digging a lot more into structurally, how is this stuff like formed and how do we break out of it, and what are the small like everyday things in your life that kind of queer your life, like queering as a verb almost.
Well, I mean, he's just such a sensual filmmaker, you know, like he really is good at communicating glances between people and the kind of energy of like two people interacting, you know, those back and forth scenes between the mum and the son is fantastic. The party scenes, you know, he's great at that kind of dialogue. You know, and he's often criticised like for like his, you know, his early films are very like a kind of music video aesthetic. You know, he is showing off a little bit in his early films with this kind of, you know, he loves like slow motion and tracking shots, and he'll put like a fancy bit of classical music over it, or a kind of pop song, and he is really good at that. But I think it does something to get away with of the films. You know, I'm thinking of something like Heartbeats, the second film. It's just full of that. But this, I think he gets the balance just right. Like I think those kind of more poetic flourishes, and I guess the kind of queer elements of the film, you know, kind of I think add to the characters. So just I was struck by just the quality of the filmmaking, I think, this time around. I also just like forgot, like when I watched this like during the pandemic, and I kind of forgot, in my head it was much more of a kind of will they won't they romance, like, but that's not what the film is at all. Actually, I'm surprised like how much he keeps Matt and Max apart throughout the film, you know, and actually it's much more about, I think, like the crisis that's going on within them, particularly Matt. Like it's funny, like Max seems actually quite cool about the kiss, and it's like, and he never really answers the question: are these guys queer or just straight guys who want the kiss because they love each other so much? You know, and I think actually you could read it both ways. But Max is certainly, he's got so much else going on in his life. But Matt is so interesting. Like I forgot he goes for that swim. You know, like my God, how symbolic! He's cleansing himself of like that kiss, and he's, you know, what's he swimming away from? Obviously, he's swimming away from like Max, you know. So like that kind of crisis that Matt goes through, I forgot how big a part of that the film is, and I forgot about how great Harris Dickinson, you know, like, yes, it's like, I think Annie's right. It's like, it's a film about like how straight guys, straight friends don't really have an outlet for their love, and they can't express it, you know, and you see them, the only thing they have is this kind of frat boy like joking around and like slapping each other's ass and stuff like that, and then it goes to the extreme with Harris Dickinson, who I think maybe the one queer character in the film. You know, he's so hyper masculine because he's you know, he's trying to hide something. So yeah, like that's what struck me. It's like, actually, you're right, it's much more of a film about masculinity, and I think just the way he puts it together with film image really kind of puts that across.
Yeah, I love the perspective that he gives us, like just being a fly on the wall at these parties, at this gaff with all these lads, and you kind of get to like lock into their dynamic and into their language, because it's such a film where no one talks about what they're feeling, and it's a really frustrating film for that reason. But there's so many like great little filmmaking techniques, like all of the symbolism and the use of weather that allow you to kind of get in on that level. But you're totally right about it kind of being like an anti-romance film, because, well, if you think of a romance film and you think of like characters getting closer over time and their moments of intimacy kind of exponentially building, whereas this is the opposite. This is like moments of hostility. The vibes are so rancid. But yeah, it's like the function of a very specific kind of masculinity, that kind of like a group of, like a male dynamic where it's so straight it loops around to being gay again. Like they're all wrestling but Matthias can't really communicate within that, because it's all done under the pretense of humour, and what he feels is very real. That's sort of what sends him running into his emotional support misogynistic work colleague.
It also like backs up one of the central theses that like runs my life, which is that friendship is one of the queerer kind of forms of relation out there, in that it isn't reproducing anything. It's not reproducing the family, it's not reproducing marriage or the couple. And it's really interesting to me that, this is a film like about the two eponymous characters, but it's also very much about that broader group of friends and the way they function. And I think you're both really right. Like, it is about their inability to express to each other how they feel, which is, I think, what masculinity sort of teaches people. And then how do you kind of channel that? I just think that's really... It's like a kind of queer film that really goes beyond like any kind of label or any kind of interest in the like identity politics, but it's just a lot more about kind of structures that allow, or kind of ways of relation that allow a kind of fluidity beyond all of that.
I was just going to say, watch it again. I really love the joke about Almodovar, because that's always been like, people have compared Xavier Dolan to Almodovar since his first films, but actually the way he uses colour in this film is very much like Almodovar. Like, I didn't actually spot it first time I watched it, but like how Max is almost always in red and Matt is always in blue, apart from the scene where they kiss, and it's like that. Yeah, like that kind of switch, you know, makes it says so much about the character. You know, Max is this softer, warmer, more passionate character, so he's wearing pinks and reds, and you know, and Matt is this kind of uptight
lawyer.
Yeah, exactly. Repressed. He's wearing denim or like you know, a blue suit. You know, the most boring suit ever. So just like again, like filming the technique of just like the costumes saying so much, and just about the class of the guys as well. Like Matt's clothes are like so ratty compared to all his friends who are like rich kids. So just reminds me what a good filmmaker Dolan is.
Yeah, I suppose touching on Almodovar, let's just kind of go on to talking about how Xavier Dolan fits into this kind of idea of a kind of new group of queer filmmakers who have come through in the 21st century. I think, Jamie, we spoke beforehand, as in it's written down in the notes, that one of the things about Dolan is that he kind of operates in very much in a kind of independent mode and like outside the bounds of studio systems or like big money moves, basically. How do you think that the kind of changing, like film in general has changed a lot, and how do you think that Xavier Dolan's work reflects like how that's changed for queer filmmakers? If that's not too broad of a question, which I feel almost certainly is, but give it a crack.
Well, I mean, he's hideously young, isn't he? So he was born, I think, in '89. So he comes of age like after the new wave, like like new queer cinema of the '90s, and after like, you know, when AIDS is no longer the killer it was, you know, like when like gay marriage is like a thing. So he coming into his own as a filmmaker in a completely different era to like, you know, in a much more kind of like open time. But then, like you say, he is working outside the system as well. He's essentially a rich kid, a rich nepo baby who paid for his own first film when he was 17, and he didn't go to film school, so he's not got any of that kind of trapping of film school. He was quite free to just make the type of film he wanted, and I think you can see that's why his films feel a bit different to other young filmmakers. I think his influences aren't necessarily from queer cinema. He sort of manages to escape. I think if you look at queer cinema before, kind of in the 70s, 80s, 90s, quite often it was a reaction against what was happening in the world. So quite often there were issue films, and because so few sort of queer filmmakers got the chance to make films, I think quite often queer filmmakers felt they had this kind of responsibility to kind of represent the community. But I think somebody like Dolan doesn't have that. He's making such personal films that I don't think he really thinks of himself as maybe a queer filmmaker. He's making, most of his films are actually about, although a lot of the characters in his films are queer, actually most of his films are about kind of more family dynamics. It's mothers, sons is a big theme. In this film, it's friendships. So it's almost like the queer elements are incidental, even though it's weaved into the filmmaking and weaved into him, obviously. That's not actually the main focus of his filmmaking. I think you see that in a lot of kind of a newer generation of queer filmmakers.
I agree. I think that for better or for worse, queer narratives in the past have been used as social issues, or to explore social issues, or to kind of have a lot of political commentary in there, because it's likely they were also sort of going out to straight audiences as well. If you think about Philadelphia in the 90s, or even in the 90s with Brokeback Mountain and stuff like that, that's a queer narrative that really exists to kind of generate sympathy for the LGBT community with such a strong condemnation of the past. But because films like Brokeback Mountain, the characters only really exist to serve that message, then they don't necessarily feel very full. Brokeback Mountain isn't a film about queer empowerment, it's a film about how queerness is a trap and it's terrible, and it's still got a really important thing to say, same in Philadelphia, but by kind of stepping away from hinging the queerness on a particular message, this can just wind up being a really intimate character study, where it's exploring these characters in this very specific place and just trying to find an emotional resonance where you can kind of meet them on.
I think it's interesting who the film is dedicated to, because he dedicates it to 4 filmmakers. So it's Eliza Hittman, Joel Edgerton, Francis Lee, and Luca Guadagnino, I think. And that's kind of the class or the peers that he's sort of situating himself within. Many of whom have made obviously Luca Guadagnino is really known for his queer films, Call Me By Your Name was a really milestone one. But there's still, all of these filmmakers kind of resist, again, that very sort of linear narrative of how queerness has functioned, like you were saying, either within kind of, these big social issue films, or even things like coming out disclosure, your first kind of sexual experience. There's a kind of fluidity to how they all approach this idea of queerness that I think he's either aligning himself with or kind of sees an affinity with, which is really interesting.
Yeah, so you mentioned Guadagnino there. Who are some other contemporaries, who do you see as kind of more of Xavier Dolan's contemporaries in terms of this idea of imagining more personal queer cinema, where the queerness is sort of in the fabric rather than the focal point?
One of the people that I really love, and it's maybe a little bit more explicit in her films, but is Celine Sciamma. And I'm thinking, obviously the film that was her breakout one that made her really, really famous was Portrait of a Lady on Fire. But I'm thinking of something like Tomboy, which operates at quite a similar level to this film, I think, in that it's not explicitly talking about identity and issues and putting kind of these milestones or narratives on things. It is just about people experiencing themselves, experiencing their gender, experiencing their desires in ways that go beyond kind of quite strict, entrapping narratives, and they're trying to figure that out. And even Portrait of a Lady on Fire is so interesting because it's a film without men in it. It's not just oh, it's these two women that are in love, and then there's all of this kind of like violence around them, is kind of taken completely outside of that context. And so, yeah, I think of her a lot with this sort of, that like wave of new queer cinema in the 21st century. And then, yeah, obviously Luca Guadagnino, something like, obviously Challenges came out afterwards. After this film, I will never shut up about Challenges. But Challenges is so interesting because it's like so gay, but it's also like not really. Like nothing actually happens. Like kind of similar to this, like two guys kiss one time and then they just like look at each other with tension for years and sit in a sauna. Like, do you know what I mean? Like that's apparently what queerness is. It is. Like honestly.
That and lots of extremely high level tennis.
Exactly, little shots, which is the gayest thing. And yeah, kind of thinking about even how like Luca Guadagnino's canon has like developed from something like Call Me By Your Name, which was developed from, or like adapted from this very like seminal book, into something like Challenges, which is just like queerness is fucking chaos. And I really love that direction that it's like that cinema is going in. There we go.
Yeah, I think that like the interesting thing about the commonality between this and like Guadagnino's work in Call Me By Your Name is that it's just against this incredibly heteronormative backdrop, and it's sort of like, I don't know, the characters obviously have such a longing for each other, and you're asking yourself, like, well, why can't they just be together? But as we've said, it's this very understated thing. It's this incredibly specific social language that you need to understand as how they're impacting the characters. So, like, yeah, Call Me By Your Name reminds me a lot of this. But there's tons of other, like, really interesting little intimate character studies, like After Sun is another one that I think of. Another one as well where the weather plays a huge part, the same as Call Me By Your Name, where like the long sort of sunny days I think make it feel really lethargic and really open the characters up to formative experiences. So yeah, around the same time actually, lots of contemporaries that have really interesting commonalities.
I would just say it's like a pretty exciting time. Like, you know, like I remember growing up, you would get like the one token queer film that broke out per year. You know, that feels like, you know, every month there's like a sort of really interesting film. You know, like just last year, something like Rose Glass, like Love Lies Bleeding. That's a great example. She's a great example of a filmmaker. You know, films with like queer characters, but essentially their queerness is incidental to the films. You know, she's making genre films. You know, which are just a blast to watch. You know, like you know, I don't think she's saying anything specifically about lesbian bodybuilders. You know, she just wants to tell a really fun story. It just happens to be the characters are gay. You know, so you see that. That's what I'm saying. Like, I feel like filmmakers maybe are a bit more free now. There's one film I actually wanted to show. We were having an argument about what we might show. I really loved last year as well. Julio Torres's film Problemista. I don't know if anyone saw it. It didn't get a big release, but it's like a really great film about a young queer guy in New York who's from El Salvador, and he's trying to like become a toy maker. You know, but so like the fact he's gay is actually the least of his problems, because he's poor. He's trying to live in New York where it's really expensive. He's trying to get a green card, and like the bureaucracy of like immigration's insane. He's got a crazy boss played by Tilda Swinton. So it's like he's a queer character who, and actually that's the easiest thing in his life, and everything else is a disaster. So like, yeah, that's what I love. Like, it's kind of freeing, I think, for filmmakers, where they can actually just make any type of film, you know. And you're not in that kind of like, you know, because I think sometimes some filmmakers do feel a little bit boxed in, you know, and you have to make a film that's going to play at a kind of like LGBTQ festival or whatever. But you know, actually they actually want everyone to see the film, and it is going to, you know, and just because it's like mainstream doesn't mean it's not going to connect with like a queer audience as well. So yeah, that's to me what's most exciting about it now. Like, I feel like there's lots of filmmakers you can categorise like that, and I think Dolan definitely fits into that as well.
Yeah, so it's one follow-on to that for you, Annie, as the Xavier Dolan stan on hand. What would you say is a good next watch after this for people who want to dig into the world to Xavier Dolan?
I really love his first film, I Killed My Mother. It's like really sexy and fun, and has like quite a similar vibe to this. To me, it's like the most similar one out of all of his films. So I think if you like this, you'll probably like that. I think the one that most people love, I do love, but it also gave me an anxiety attack, is Mummy. which is about a very difficult relationship between a young boy and his mother. It has an incredible, I think, Oasis needle drop, is it? Yeah, it's so good. And I think in a way that's maybe where his filmmaking is like the sharpest. But yeah, if your parents stress you out, it is a stressful film. But it is good. And then, yeah, in terms of other like kind of queer cinema, man, there's just like, yeah, you're right. There's just like so much at the moment that kind of feels almost like difficult to pinpoint kind of, oh, there's that like one big film that came out each year. Because it just, I think when I was like making my list of like the best films last year, almost all of them were like kind of queer in some way. And like, what a time to live in, which is so nice.
I think something really interesting is happening at the current moment, because you were talking about Love Lies Bleeding, which is this sort of big crime caper with bodybuilders, and you were talking about Challengers, which is a sports film. So I wonder if like now filmmakers, you're right, feel more liberated to kind of it's like queer genre cinema. Like filmmakers are more liberated to interweave queer narratives into like more conventional, more mainstream story structures, so that they open to wider releases and people are more excited about them. But there's just a lot of like creativity going on, and they don't necessarily hinge on queer characters.
Yeah, I guess the kind of like thing, the elephant in the room is obviously we're living in a time of obviously populism is on the rise. Like it feels like every government in the world is like going right wing. The fact I'm saying these films are getting made because we live in a time now where actually all these rights have been won. Might not be won forever. So I do wonder if actually maybe something like the kind of punky spirit of the new queer cinema might emerge in that kind of environment. Like the fact that was reacting against like the treatments of people with AIDS, the Reagan's treatment of that crisis, and just the Reagan administration in general. That kind of right wing, like family is everything. So I wonder if that might come back, like a more kind of punky, wild, formally daring queer cinema, and that's obviously out there. Like there's I think we're talking about more mainstream kind of American stuff, but if you look all around the world, there's like still filmmakers who are making like those type of films. But I just wonder if that might become a more dominant type of film. When all these kind of like things are up for grabs, I think, from like a lot of governments around the world.
Yeah, that is feels like a bit of a downer to end on.
I want to know what you thought of it. Peter is our token straight guy on the podcast, and this was your first time watching it.
Yeah, this is my first time watching. I think it's maybe my first Xavier Dolan film, full stop.
Oh, crazy.
I really loved the energy of it, and I think like the changing energy of it is something that is so impressive. And like I think everybody has kind of said that ebbing and flowing and the speeding up and slowing down, that really does put you into the situation. Like, when you're in a situation where you're not sure what you want, you're not sure why you're not sure you might want it, those are the moments that seem to go on forever. But you're at a party with your friends having a laugh, and that goes through hours and hours in the space of like 20 seconds. And I just thought that like, Xavier's use of time and that kind of like, changing of like little things like colour grade here, slowing them down or speeding up there, it really does make a film that, as we've all said, is kind of like is quite a small scale in its own way, like domestic story about these guys who are not sure what they're up to. It makes it feel like a big, dramatic, powerful thing that's going on. It's like, lads, you've been smooching. It's cool. It's fine. It's good.
It is good. It's so nice.
I was going to say one thing. I actually, as much as I love the film, did anyone else frustrated by the ending? Like, I feel like, maybe I'm just being a basic bitch, but I wanted some more closure here. Like, what's going on with, like, the mother and the other son? Like, you get one glimpse, what's going on there? Like, what, is he going to go to Australia? Are they going to be, like, make out? I don't know, I don't know. I like ambiguity. I just wanted a bit more, I don't know, I feel it's a bit of a cop-out then. I feel like...
Jerry's in the back row smooching his Matthias Maxime figures together.
As you should. I think it's interesting, when I first watched this film, it was the pandemic, and I was so depressed. And I was like, oh my God, this is so romantic. And I sent it to my friend, and she watched it, and she was like, I hated the ending. And we were just talking about this because Matthias is a dickhead, and he doesn't really like deserve to like get him back in any way. And it's really interesting that at the time I was like projecting my own kind of like romantic narrative onto this thing where it was like, oh yeah, it is that they end up together, or in some way there's like a reconciliation. And actually having like rewatched it over the years in a much more complex state of mind, I think it's interesting that, there is that ambiguity and we actually don't know if they do. Like, I think actually in a way it's more implied that he goes to Australia, that it's just that he has like shown up in some way. And it kind of goes back to what you were saying, that this is not, we think of it, it's like almost billed as like this romance, and it's actually not a romance at all. It is a lot more about just how do you exist in relation to people if you don't have the structures and the narratives that enable you, things like marriage, heterosexuality, these things that like just let you go like a tram on the tracks and you just know where you're going. If you don't have that, how do you begin to relate to people with all their messiness and all their desires? And I think the ending kind of encapsulates that for me, which I really
it is an incredibly open ending. I think that actually affords the characters a lot of autonomy, because remember, the whole point is that the characters are just really, really full in ways that we're trying to understand, but not necessarily. But yeah, it is kind of an ambiguous relationship they have. Even earlier on, you said that they might not even be gay. It might just be two guys who really love each other. But that allows this sort of setting of a film full of pining and longing and staring, and Matthias dramatically storming out of the same party 3 times in one night. He's trying to convince everyone he's straight. He's doing a better job. But yeah, so like it is a really interesting kind of film in a weird way for the characters.
Yeah, and it's probably better that it ends ambiguously rather than just a firm, gentlemanly handshake.
Oh my God, imagine.
And then just goes to Australia and that's it.
Maybe there's going to be a sequel. I would love to, like, I actually feel like this should be a TV show. I feel like there's actually so much in this film that I want to see more about. Like I do think that these characters could have a life beyond this film, you know. I guess that's all good films. You think about what the characters are doing like 5 years later, you know. So like maybe that's the success of the movie. But yeah, if he's going to come back and make films, I would love to see, you know, maybe the little sisters are going to Cannes now. She could be a great filmmaker.
To Matthias Maxime.